As I mentioned last night, the Parsha deals with the mitzvah of קידוש החודש, the establishment of the Jewish calendar. So I'd like to add to what I said last night to you, and give it a sort of an historical perspective as well. In the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah teaches us that the Sanhedrin in Yerushalayim, which declared when Rosh Chodesh was, and as I explained to you, sometimes they declared it on the basis of witnesses, but sometimes they adjusted it depending on how it had to be in order to reconcile itself to the actual astronomical calendar. So they had to have a method of communicating their decision to the Jews who lived especially in Bovel, because that was the main site of the exile. The other site of the exile was Egypt. But apparently to Egypt it was close enough that somehow they could get messengers there. But to Bovel it was a further distance. So the Gemara says they had a system of bonfires on top of tall peaks. There were 7 mountains that were established. And one of them you can see if you drive up the Jordan Valley. Sarbata is there. So on top of that peak, which overlooks the entire area, so they lit a bonfire, and then people saw the bonfire, they lit the second, the third, all the way, and the Gemara says, Ad Sheir Heir Pnei Kol HaMizrach, until it was the entire horizon was alight with these bonfires, and therefore the Jews in Bovel knew that they had declared that night to be the beginning of Rosh Chodesh. Then the Gemara says that they stopped that. Mishakil kalu ad tzdukim. Now the tzdukim were very powerful and numerous sect that existed from the time of the Chashmonaim onwards, who opposed rabbinic Judaism. And they many times even gained control of the Beit HaMikdash. We find that before Yom Kippur, the Gemara in Yoma teaches us that the Chachamim had to give an oath to the Kohen Gadol that he would perform properly, because there was a difference of opinion between the Tzdokim and the Prushim as to how the Avodah should be conducted. So the Tzdokim were a potent force, and they opposed the Rabbonim. They opposed rabbinic Judaism in all of its forms. And they made an alternate. They had their own brand. And today we call it pluralism. They do what they want. So they purposely sabotaged this system of the bonfires. They would light the bonfires on the wrong night, or they would extinguish the bonfires once they were lit, so that the rabbis could no longer rely upon it. And to a great extent, that is what created for us the second day of Yom Tov in the exile, because of the fact that the messengers from the Sanhedrin could not reach Bovel in time, and therefore they would not know which day was Pesach, or etc. So therefore, that's why the idea of Yom Tov Sheni Shel Goliath entered. And it's interesting that that's always the thing that's opposed even today, is the Yom Tov Sheni. Because again, that was a rabbinic thing, and it's minig avosenu b'yodeinu. Okay, so now let's go forward another few hundred years. And then now there's a great dispute again regarding the calendar. There was a Rav in Yerushalayim, he was in the 9th century, in the 800s. His name was Ben Meir. He was a great Talmud Chacham. And he was, he was the titular head of the Bezdin in Yerushalayim. And he was an astronomer and a mathematician. And he made the calculations, and he said the rabbinic calendar is wrong. It's not accurate to what the actuality is, and that they're off by the molad close to 18 hours. And therefore he said that in this year, Pesach begins on, let's say, on Monday, and the Chachomim said Pesach begins on Tuesday. And since everybody always has a following, so in that year there were Jews that ate Chometz b'Pesach, depending whose opinion you were holding. And this continued for about 3 years. And it was a major dispute in the Jewish world. His main antagonist, the one that represented the rabbinic tradition, was Rabbeinu Saadia Gaon, who was a polemicist, who wrote and who took up the war. So he took up the war against the Karoim, and he took up the war against Ben Meir, and he also took up the war against the Gaonic leadership of his time in Bovel. He was all of his life involved in controversies. But he wrote extensively to disprove the thesis of Ben Meir, and that the rabbinic calendar was the accurate calendar, and that was the one to be followed. And after about 4 or 5 years, the machlokas died out, and Ben Meir no longer was alive, and the calendar as we have it today was judged to be correct, and that became the ruling calendar from then on. In the later times, so part of in the false messiah of Shabtai Tzvi, which was a tremendously tragic event in Jewish history, so he also attempted to adjust the calendar. But he didn't do it on the basis of mathematics. He said he had revelation. Now, you can't argue with someone who says he has revelation, right? Because how do you disprove it? But then later on, when he became an apostate, so it became obvious that anything that he said was not to be taken seriously, certainly not in Jewish life. And the calendar was again reestablished. Then the second time it happened 60 years later in Poland. There was another false messiah movement of a man by the name of Yaakov Frank. They were the Frankisten. Eventually they all ended up converting to Catholicism. But for a while they were also popular. You know that, I don't know how to put it nicely, but anything that's new, that's good, that's going to do it, right? I mean, that's why we have all these new political parties also. deep down in your heart, you know that it's useless. But, it's new. New people, maybe they have a better idea. So that always existed. And they always tinkered with the calendar. And the calendar was the focal point of changing. In the 19th century, when Reform took over in Germany, there was a great discussion amongst Reform Jews, the Reform rabbis, what to do with the calendar. And interestingly enough, they retained the traditional calendar, that they did away with the second day of Yom Tov. I notice in the United States that those that don't keep the second day don't keep the first day either, which is a natural outgrowth of such policies. But they decided that they would keep the traditional calendar, even though there was a movement not to do so. And as I mentioned to you, the French Revolution was so radical that they wanted to change all calendars. And they wanted to have a 10-day week and a 10-month year and all sorts of radical changes that, again, it didn't take hold. In the rise of the Soviet Union, in the atheism that it practiced and enforced, especially against the Jews, having a Jewish calendar was an offense, a criminal offense. Rabbi Teitz told me, Rabbi Teitz was active in the early 1960s with Soviet Jewry, so he was able to, through political connections in the United States that had influence in Russia, he was able, that the Russian government allowed him to bring in Sidurim, prayer books, in Hebrew. And it said that in the title page, it said, this siddur is for tourists only. But once the book gets in, it gets in. And then he tried to do something else. He tried to print calendars and bring the calendars in, and that they did not allow. They allowed prayer books, but they did not allow calendars, because they had the sense of the matter that somehow if the Jews had the Jewish calendar, it would still remain Jewish. And that really was the secret for Soviet Jewry, is that somehow they knew when Simchas Torah was. So the 50,000 Jews gathered in Moscow in front of the Choral Synagogue, because with Simchas, they didn't know what Simchas Torah was, but they knew that Simchas Torah existed, and that was the day. And the Soviet Union attempted to destroy the Jewish people by banning the calendar, by saying that the Jewish calendar shouldn't exist, because the rhythm of Jewish life is based on the calendar. It's based on the holidays of the year. It's like a musical symphony. There's a rhythm to the Jewish year. I mean, now we're coming to Shvat, it'll be Tu B'Shvat, and then we'll come to Ador, and we'll come, you're always going ahead. It's Purim, it's Pesach, it's going to be. And they realize that. So throughout the Jewish history, we have seen that the Jewish calendar is central to Jewish life. And perhaps that's one of the reasons why the Torah emphasizes it so. The first mitzvah of the Torah, החודש הזה לכם, we would say the first mitzvah is ואהבת את Hashem Elokecha, or other things that are me'ikrei adas, that are part of the foundation of Judaism. And here we're talking about a calendar. But the calendar is the secret of our survival. And therefore, by having it and knowing it, and nurturing it and preserving it, so that contributes to the eternity of Klal Yisrael. Rabbi Chananya ben Akashia Omer Rotza HaKadosh Baruch Hu L'Zakos Yisrael V'fichach Hirba Lahem Torah and Mitzvot Shenemar Aranoi Chavei Tzman Tzidko Yavil Torah V'Yah